19. The perfect storm. O God, that ere this tongue of mine that laid the sentence of dread banishment on yon proud man should take it off again. Shakespeare, King Richard II, 3.3, verse 134 to 136. On September 22nd, 1973, Ardashir Zahidi, then Iran's ambassador to the United States, sent one of his many strictly confidential reports for the Shah's eyes only. The content of these reports was so sensitive that Zahidi would not even trust his staff with the task of typing them, writing instead in his own almost illegible handwriting. They were then placed in a special briefcase with only two keys, one in Tehran with the Shah and the other with Zahidi in Washington. He had seen this system used for the transfer of highly sensitive materials when he was Iran's ambassador to Britain. The same firm that made the safe courier briefcase for the office of the British Prime Minister made one on order for the Shah Zahidi's correspondence. Couriers would carry the briefcase to Tehran with the case handcuffed to their wrist and then bring back the response, sometimes in the margins of the notes in the Shah's polished and neat handwriting, and sometimes by letters from the Shah's chief of staff, Nasrullah Monian, or his private physician, Dr. Ayadi, judging by the number of reports he read and commented on from Zahidi alone. It appeared that, as his confidants claim, he did indeed sometimes work well into the night. Zahidi's reports were not, of course, the only ones the Shah read carefully. Other top officials of the regime say that while the Prime Minister and other cabinet members generally ignored their reports, the Shah read them carefully and returned them with his decisions. Early in his second term as Iran's ambassador to the United States, Zahidi learned through the wind-induced confession of a reliable American source who worked at the White House that coded confidential telegrams from the Iranian embassy to the Shah, were regularly intercepted by agencies of the U.S. government. As he wrote to the Shah, even before receiving this news, Zahidi had expected as much. A few weeks earlier, Henry Kissinger had prematurely mentioned a matter that Zahidi had confidentially reported to the Shah only in an encrypted message. In the September 22nd note, written on pages of a legal pad, with the Shah's marginal notes appearing in red pencil, Zahidi reported meeting with a high-ranking U.S. official. The name of the official does not appear on the document, and today, more than 35 years later, Zahidi has no recollection of his identity. The report is remarkable for the nature of the official's inquiries and the Shah's responses. The first question related to the Shah's physical and mental health: is the Shah well? The American official asked Zahidi. The question is surprising, for at the time there had been no public discussion of the Shah's health in Iran or in the West. Were some agencies in the United States already privy to some news about the Shah's health problems? Toward the end of 1973, or about the time the American official asked his surprising question, the Shah, while vacationing on the Isle of Kish, noticed a curve on his left hypochondrium, abdominal area. He had consulted first his own physicians, Dr. Ayadi, whose medical acumen the Shah did not always trust, and then Dr. Abbas Safavian, Alam's friend and physician. They decided to consult with European physicians, and thus it was that on May 1st, 1974, Dr. Georges Flandrin flew to Tehran and, under a great veil of secrecy, diagnosed the Shah as suffering from lymphocytic blood disease. Neither dispatches from the U.S. and British embassies in Tehran in those years nor declassified national intelligence estimates give any indication that either of the governments had any knowledge of this diagnosis or of the Shah's health problem. It became the policy of the Shah and his three male confidants, Alam, Ayadi, and Safavian, as well as his French physicians, to keep the story of the Shah's illness strictly confidential, not even telling the Queen, who was by law the regent in the event of the Shah's death. She learned about the sickness more than 3 years later. Ironically, in those days, Tehran was so rife with rumors of the Shah's illness, even of his death at the hand of an angry nephew, that at one time Zahedi arranged for Barbara Walters to visit Tehran and interview the Shah, thus confirming his continued good health. The Shah clearly worried that if Western powers learned about his sickness, they would use it against him. He was in those days engaged in increasingly acrimonious negotiations with Europe and the United States regarding the price of oil. So worried was he about the Western response to his demands for higher prices that he ordered the government to substantially increase Iran's supply of stored sugar, tea, wheat, and a few other necessities, lest they try to pressure us by imposing an embargo, he told Feryadun Mahdavi, the minister in charge of trade. The haste of these purchases eventually led to allegations of kickbacks received by officials in charge of the 250 million sugar transaction. Even Shapur reporter, the storied M16 man in Iran, was implicated in the embarrassing case. In court papers in Iran, he confirmed that he had accepted £300,000 for acting as a representative of the British company. The Shah's fears of an embargo turned out to be baseless, but his belief that Western powers might use his sickness against him were neither hyperbolic nor paranoid. As Roger Owen, then the British Foreign Secretary, made clear, had the US and UK governments known about the Shah's cancer, they would have acted decisively to force the Shah to admit his illness publicly and to leave Tehran and appoint a regency. Zahedi's American interlocutor on that September 22nd meeting went on to say that he had heard that all was not well in Iran, that there was mounting dissent and dissatisfaction among larger and larger swaths of the population. Is the Shah increasingly isolated from reality? The official asked, and surrounded by those who do not tell him the truth. This is all nonsense, the Shah wrote. This kind of information is given to them by a bunch of American puppets. A few weeks later, receiving this report, the Shah told the combative Italian journalist Oriander Fallaci that he not only received messages from God, but that he received reports from a dozen different sources about all that went on in the country. When in 1971 Alam suggested to the Shah that he should occasionally invite simple people from different strata to the court and hear from them the people's complaints, the Shah dismissed that idea as well, repeating the mantra, "I receive reports from multiple sources." The American official also claimed that sometimes even the economic statistics given to the Shah were not accurate. Here on the margin, the Shah wrote, "This stuff is probably fed to them by Mahdi Semi, the Khordadad Farman Farmaian. These men were two of Iran's most respected and experienced bankers and economists, known for their probity and professionalism. By the time of this discussion between Zahedi and his American source, both men were out of government jobs, working in the private sector. The American interlocutor continued his remarkable line of queries by saying that, according to his information, the numbers of militant dissidents were swelling from the ranks of the intellectuals, and the signs of student discontent at the universities were hard to ignore. Why is the Shah not apprised of this dire situation? The American official asked. The Shah wrote in the margin, "These are all propaganda and old cliché," using the English words for propaganda and old cliché. "In Iran there are no true intellectuals. These are all Marxists. Recently we have even found Islamic Marxists." More than once in those days the Shah made such dismissive public pronouncements about the opposition. More than once he accused them all of being, at best, inadvertent tools of foreign powers. The 2,500 years of monarchy celebration in 1971, what Newsweek had called the Bash of Bashes, was a propaganda bonanza for the opposition, particularly the Confederation of Iranian Students, which had spared no effort in tarnishing the image of the Shah and his regime. They went so far as to forge documents that showed that Savak was illegally active in Europe and the United States and was tracking not just Iranian students but Western opponents of the regime, even members of Western governments. The documents created a public relations nightmare for the Shah and were followed by investigations by Western governments into Savak's alleged illegal activities in Europe and the United States. The Confederation organization, one of the biggest rallies in its history when the Shah made his last official visit to the Carter White House in November 1977. Students and activists were encouraged to travel to Washington from all over the United States. The Iranian embassy also rallied royalists from all over the country to come to Washington and welcome the Shah. Travel expenses plus a generous honorarium were used as inducements. For reasons hard to fathom, both massive groups had been issued permits by the Washington police and the FBI that allowed them to come dangerously close to each other and to the White House. When, as expected, they engaged in a pitched battle, the police tried to separate them with the use of tear gas. A picture of the Shah wiping off tears induced by the gas was broadcast all over the world and became a poignant image of his beleaguered state. More than once, the Shah and Savak accused not only the Soviet Union and China, but the United States and Western European nations of supporting, indeed underwriting, the Confederation. The Shah's comments, written in the margins of this confidential roll, strongly suggest that he did not make those pronouncements simply to score easy political points, but that he, in fact, firmly believed them. When the American official asked Zahedi about increasing public resentment about corruption again, the Shah dismissed the charge, writing in the margin, "It is the Western sickness with money that causes some problems." He also asked Zahedi, more in a tone of sarcasm than concern, to demand specific names from his American interlocutor. In those days, even when Savak's 3rd Division, which was in charge of internal security, submitted reports about corruption in high places and described them as an issue of national security, the Shah brushed them off. For example, one such report was prepared on Hushang Devalue Qajar. He was called the Sultan of Caviar, and one of the Shah's more sympathetic biographies calls him the most notorious of the Shah's friends. He was the closest thing to the Shah's court jester, making jokes at everyone's expense preparing culinary delicacies the Shah favored and acting efficiently as his designated master of royal mirth. Davolu was also known for his heavy addiction to opium. Alam refers to a couple of occasions when Davolu tried to interest the Shah in exploring the soothing powers of what Coleridge called the milk of paradise. Alam claims that he strongly objected to the idea, reminding the Shah that people were executed for dealing opium. Davolu was said to be a born courtier, a sycophant par excellence, and a superior pimp. Though the queen generally despised these royal procurers of pleasure, Davolu was such a pleasant conversationalist that even she enjoyed his company and invited him to the court. Davolu's house was renowned for its day-long sessions of opium smoking, and because he was known for his influence on the Shah, became a mecca for those seeking special favors. It was reported that the special suite of rooms Davolu kept at the luxurious Georges V Hotel in Paris also became a virtual opium den when he was in town. Everyone seemed to look the other way in accommodating his addiction. However, in 1971, on his annual ski trip to Switzerland, the Shah learned that there was a Swiss warrant for Davolu's arrest. He was being sought for allegedly having passed a large quantity of opium to another Iranian citizen. Incredibly, the Shah ordered his official plane to whisk Davolu home to Iran. He then entrusted Alam with the job of solving the resulting legal, diplomatic, and public relations nightmare. According to Alam's journals and two documents that had since been made public, hundreds of thousands of dollars were spent on lawyers, doctors, who testified that Davolu needed a daily dose of 25 grams of opium for medical reasons. Swiss journalists, to ensure more friendly coverage of the episode, and even Swiss jurists who were invited to Iran for a royal vacation as a token of gratitude. The money was spent to both contain the crisis and ensure that Davolu served no time in prison. After his inquiry about corruption, the American official asked Zahedi whether the Iranian army remained reliably loyal to the crown. Why should they not be satisfied and reliable? The Shah wrote tartly on the margin, adding that they were provided with all they needed. When the reliability of the bureaucracy was questioned, the Shah wrote in English, "They have misguided, paternalistic information about us." The Shah's final reactions to more statements of concern were no less angry. He accused the American official of simply repeating the claims of the Tudeh propaganda machine and the National Front, who are their lackeys. They then asked, not necessarily rhetorically, whether it is true that they, the United States and the Russians, have conspired together against us. The Shah's last comment on the 1973 Zahedi report reflected his attitude towards critical reports, particularly at this period. He asked Zahedi to reduce to a minimum his contacts with this person, and then, as if in an afterthought, he wrote, in reality, it is we who are concerned about the Americans' future. Rapidly rising oil revenue and sharply increasing improvements in nearly every standard economic indicator further allowed the Shah to ignore these rumblings of discontent, or what he once called these gloomy prophets of doom. By the time Zahedi's remarkable September report, the Shah was increasingly self-assured and openly critical of what he disparagingly considered the many maladies of a blue-eyed Western world and its democracy. Early in his reign, he had regularly praised democracy, and he fondly remembered his education in the Democratic Society of Switzerland. By the early 1970s, his disposition had changed dramatically. He regularly chided Western democracies for their lack of moral political ethos, prophesying their imminent demise. He was certain he often claimed that the singular righteousness of his own ways and values would be recognized. The Shah's new disposition, combined with the rapidly changing fabric of Iranian society and the global trend toward democracy, created a particularly incongruent and thus volatile situation in Iran. About a year before the Zahedi note on November 11, 1972, Joseph Farland, then U.S. ambassador to Iran, had met with Alam and voiced some anxiety about signs of disgruntlement amongst the clergy. Not only the 2,500-year celebration, but the further enfranchisement of women had raised their ire. But then Iran had in the person of Farouk Ruparza, a much acclaimed educator, its first woman minister. Princess Ashraf was increasingly active, not just in controversial economic activities, but in politics. She was spearheading the government, sponsored women's movements that championed, in increasingly defiant language, more rights for Iranian women. A remarkably progressive new proposed family law that went a long way in affording women equal rights in the mid-70s was arguably one of the most enduring works of this organization. Around this time, Ashraf also asked for several $1,000,000 from the Shah to ensure that she could become the president of the UN General Assembly meeting. The Shah was opposed to this idea and rejected the request. Nevertheless, her increasing public presence was, even for the pro-Shah clergy, the cause of considerable consternation. Ironically, only a few weeks before this conversation with the American ambassador, Alam had reported to the Shah that he had heard a sermon on the radio by a famous cleric who had prayed for everyone except the Shah, anyone who seeks popularity. Alam ventured to say, seems to do so by distancing themselves from us. Yet when Alam heard Farland's concern, he repeated to him what he had often recited to the Shah as a mantra: the grumbling of the clergy is nothing but petty infighting. He added, in his normal, grandiose manner, when I was prime minister, mullahs united with communist and nomadic tribes rose up against the regime. They could not do a damn thing. I destroyed them. I crushed them once and for all. Farland responded to this facile, self-deluding narrative by simply saying, if you say so. In less than 7 years, Alam's crushed clerics deposed the Shah and created a new regime of clerical despotism. Oh, God. In less than 7 years, Alam's crushed clerics deposed the Shah and created a new regime of clerical despotism. The American embassy was, of course, not entirely convinced of Alam's words of reassurance. A couple of years later, in 1975, the new American ambassador, Richard Helms, captured the nature of the Shah's vulnerability when he wrote that the conflict between rapid economic growth and modernization vis-a-vis a still autocratic rule was the greatest uncertainty about the Shah's future. Helms went on to say that, alas, history provides discouraging precedents for a peaceful resolution of this conflict. I can recall no example of a ruler, he said, willingly loosening the reins of power. Helms was only partially right. Not long after his report, the Shah began a liberalization process. However, the timing for this liberalization could not have been worse. A fall in the price of oil was shrinking government revenues, and at the same time there were increasing inflationary pressures on the economy. The election of Jimmy Carter in November 1976 not only forced the Shah to expedite his liberalization plans, but also emboldened Iran's democratic opposition. Moreover, the Shah's physical ailments and characteristic indecisiveness in times of crisis rendered him increasingly less capable of decisive action. Add to these already momentous patterns a fact known to political theorists since Aristotle, that authoritarian societies face their biggest challenge when they seek to liberalize. And the combination had the makings of a perfect storm, as rare a phenomenon in the world of meteorology as in the realm of politics. Some in SAVAK tried to warn the Shah about what a Carter presidency and his human rights policy might mean for the Shah and the future stability of his regime. Parviz Sabeti, in charge of domestic security, prepared a new intelligence estimate for the Shah that addressed this issue. It warned of a potentially serious crisis facing the regime and demanded a plan of action to confront and contain the crisis. It indicated that the same coalition of opponents that had challenged the Shah in 1963, the urbane middle class, student members of the bazaar, the urban poor, Marxist groups, some nomadic tribes, and the radical clergy and their Islamic allies, were waiting for an occasion to challenge the Shah again. In 1963, the report claimed the opposition had been buoyed by the Kennedy administration's talk of democracy and reform. And in 1977, Carter's human rights policies were once again awakening in them a will to fight. The SAVAK report asserted that this time the challenge would be even more serious than in 1963. There were more people living in concentrated quarters in cities, more urban poor, more Marxists, more revolutionaries, many trained by Palestinian groups in armed struggle, more college students, and more moderate Democrats willing to join the opposition. If they sensed any weakness in the regime, they would engage in confrontation, and this time, the report said, it might be more difficult to roll back their challenge. In one fascinating study prepared as a master's thesis by Parviz Nekaha, the sudden surge in the 1960s and 1970s in the number of Talab, singular for Taliban, Arabic for seminarian, was found to be a serious sociological anomaly requiring both explanation and attention. In Iran itself, from 1925 to 1941, during the reign of Reza Shah, the number of seminarians had decreased from 2,949 to 784. Generally, as societies modernize, Nekaha rightly pointed out, and as urbanism increases, the number of seminarians tends to diminish. In Iran, the reverse had happened. Moreover, in the last decade of the Shah's rule, the increase in the number of mosques and seminaries had been even more remarkable. By 1977, there were more than 75,000 such establishments in Iran. Yet, in spite of the fact that Nekaha was in charge of research for Iran's national radio and television, and in spite of the fact that earlier in his life he had been a theorist of a new Iranian left, no attention was paid to his findings. The conclusion of the SAVAK report was more political and indicated that any hint of weakness in the regime of succumbing to the human rights policies of a new Carter administration would trigger a rapid slide into a systematic crisis. The Shah was incensed by SAVAK report. He accused Sabbatai of treasonously overlooking the fruits of the Shah and People Revolution. Do they mean to say, he reportedly asked, that we have accomplished nothing in the last 2 decades? Are workers not with us after we made them stockholders in the factories they worked in? Will women who have been enfranchised during their reign join the opposition? The underlying premises of the report and the retort captured the Shah's illusion and Savak's delusion. Economic progress, the Shah believed, would mollify people's demand for democracy. His secret police continued to seek the solution with an iron fist. Parts of Savak's early warning, in fact strikingly similar to the analysis offered by Anthony Parsons, the British ambassador, during the heat of the crisis, the Shah, Parsons said, had kept the country under severe discipline for 15 years while he had pursued his policy of rapid modernization. It was inevitable that when the discipline was relaxed, there would be a violent release of popular emotion. Parson noted that the massive influx into the cities from the rural areas had created a rootless urban proletariat of dimensions hitherto unknown in Iran, who had nothing to look forward to, and in this case of mine, it was natural for them in turn to their traditional guides and leaders, the religious hierarchy. However, since the traumas of 1953, the Shah had insisted on the indispensability of his authoritarian rule. As he did deliver rapid economic progress, and as it is hard to argue with success, the paradigm of authoritarian modernization had remained unchallenged. A CIA profile of the Shah, prepared in the middle 1970s, concluded that he now believed that democracy would impede economic development. Sometimes he criticized the endemic frailties of democracy. Other times he merely asserted that Iranians were not yet ready for democracy. He believed that only he could and should determine when and whether the time for such democratic transition had arrived. By the time the Shah was willing or was pressured by Carter to make some of these changes, he was already deemed too valuable and weak by his opponents. By the time the Shah was willing or was pressured by Carter to make some of these changes, he was already deemed too vulnerable and weak by his opponents. Before long, they wanted his throne, not just an offer of a democratic opening. The rapidity of economic development in the 1960s and early 1970s had fueled the Shah's grandiosity. According to the CIA, the Shah had a concept of himself as a leader with a divinely blessed mission to lead his country from years of stagnation into a major power, supported by a large military establishment. In 1977, Iran spent 10.6% of its GNP on the military. France spent only 3.9%, Turkey 5.5%, and Iran's local rival, Iraq, only 8.75% of their corresponding GNP. As Iran was undergoing rapid economic change, the Shah followed a scorched earth policy against the country's moderate and leftist forces. He also believed that the clergy, with the exception of the Khomeini supporters, who were suppressed, were his reliable allies in the fight against communists and secular nationalists. His policy left the clergy and their nimble network of organizations an opportunity to grow and to monopolize the public domain. When in October 1969 moderate religious leaders sent a message to the Shah and to the U.S. Embassy that they were worried about the situation in the country and angry at Khomeini for putting them in a difficult position of either choosing his radicalism or being branded as a reactionary mullah of the court, the Shah chose to ignore their warnings. More than once, similar warnings from the moderate clergy, about everything from the Shah's sudden decision to date the calendar from the birth of Cyrus the Great, rather than from Muhammad's Hegira. 1355 suddenly became 2535 to new progressive laws about women and family protection were dismissed. Open letters and declarations from moderate secular politicians, leaders of the National Front, independent moderate opposition figures like Khalil Maliki and Mozaffar Baghi were ignored or more often punished. Instead, the Shah basked in the self-congratulating complacency of courtiers like Azadullah Alam, who was constantly reminding the Shah that radical clergy like Khomeini had been neutralized in 1963. The more the Shah ignored the moderate clergy, the easier it became for Khomeini and his radical allies to gain and consolidate hegemony over religious forces in Iran. Aside from using all these grievances against the Shah in traditional mosques, religious forces had, by the 1970s, also developed the idea of Hassiniya, a lecture hall that used modern trappings to cultivate a Shiite theology that was more rational in approach and shorn of superstition. The halls usually allowed people to sit on chairs, by then a habit of the middle class, and forego the more traditional mosque practice of sitting on the floor. The most famous of these halls, called Hosinaye Irshad, was built in one of Tehran's upper-class neighborhoods. The financial support came from members of the bazaar who were close to the religious members of the National Front, the Freedom Movement, and the ideological management of the center was in the hands of Khomeini supporters. Every move they made, we now know, was made after consultation with Khomeini, who was in exile in Najaf. At this Hosseiniya, more moderate clergy like Ayatollah Motahari and eloquent Islamist orators like Ali Shariata, himself an active member of the National Front when he was a student in Europe, offered a vision of Shiism that was more amenable to modernity and democracy. Amongst those influenced by Shariati's rhetoric was Mir Hossein Mousavi, who now leads the Green Movement, and his influential wife, Zahra Ranavard, though Shariata was known partially for his fierce critique of the Shiite clergy, calling them symbols of a despotic and stale Islam. He usually praised Khomeini as an exception, calling him a progressive cleric fighting relentlessly against despotism and colonialism. By the early 70s, Khomeini had found supporters amongst secular intellectuals as well. The most important such support was initially offered by Jalal al-Ahmad, an influential writer and essayist of the 1960s who had called the clergy leaders in the important fight against colonialism. Al-Ahmad had even argued that the clergy were an essential part of the country's intellectual class. More than any other ideology, the writings of the likes of Al-Ahmad and Shariati prepared the context for Khomeini's leadership of the democratic movement. By promoting economic changes that created a new, wealthy, more educated middle class, and then denying them the political rights they sought, and by allowing only the clergy to organize and mobilize the population, the Shah inadvertently pushed these moderate forces into Khomeini's camp. As early as 1962, Khomeini advisors had written that the political future of Iran was in the hands of those who could mobilize the rising middle class. Using a modern iteration of Shiism, the clergy were virtually the only group given a chance to mobilize and organize this critical social class. Ironically, by the early 1970s, even the Shah realized that his regime faced a serious political challenge. In October 1972, he grew disgruntled with Emir Abbas Hoveyda's Iran Novin Party. In October 1972, he grew disgruntled with Emir Abbas Hoveyda's Iran Novin Party. The party had originally been created to organize the middle class, but by the early 1970s it was staging party congresses that smacked of Communist Party rituals. Searching for a remedy, the Shah summoned Mehdi Sama to court. Sama was one of Iran's most respected technocrats and had extensive connections amongst middle-class moderate intellectuals and the leaders of the National Front. He had gone to England in the mid-1930s on a government scholarship and had taken courses with Harold Laski. The Shah told Sama of his worries about the future and about the problem of transition, particularly after his death, and asked him to launch a new political party that would successfully solicit the support of the Iranian educated middle classes for a peaceful transition. After some initial resistance, Sami agreed to take up the challenge. His reticence was particularly understandable in light of Alanagi Kenny's fate. In 1971, Kenny had been named Secretary General of the Party of Martyrdom, supposedly the loyal opposition to the Iran Movin Party. According to the U.S. Embassy, during his brief tenure, Kenny invigorated the party and made it appear a more legitimate, loyal opposition. In a party demonstration in Isfahan, Kenny had called the Hoveyda cabinet reactionary and declared that if free elections were held, he and his party would easily defeat Hoveyda. The Shah was livid when he heard reports of the meeting. How dare he say that elections are not free during my reign? He fumed to Alam, with no apparent irony. Within 24 hours, Kenny was dismissed from all his positions. Nevertheless, beginning in late 1972, Sami met regularly with the Shah for almost 5 months, discussing and setting out the parameters of the new party's actions. Fortunately, Sami took copious notes every time he met with the Shah. These notes indicate that the Shah wanted a new kind of loyal opposition party, a centrist party with hints of social democratic ideas in its proposed platform. Of course, the Shah could still not fathom a truly independent, loyal opposition, one that could in fact attract those elements which would not join the existing parties. The Shah told Sami he would be looked after salary-wise. At the same time, the Shah emphasized that he was against a one-party system, as it would invariably entail a distasteful dictatorship. The Shah insisted that the principles of his revolution could not, of course, be subjected to criticism. Sami gingerly answered that, in order to create the institution, His Imperial Majesty underlined the term institution, and to build up reliable public men, there had to be debate and criticism. The Shah agreed, but added unequivocally that such criticism could not take the form of Kenny calling my government reactionary or doubting the legitimacy of elections. The minutes of these meetings clearly show that the Shah knew what his regime needed, but was unwilling or afraid to allow it to develop. The Shah gave an example of what his envisioned loyal opposition could do. He suggested that the police, for example, had recently found that the dynamite used by saboteurs was sold to them by people of our railroad administration. We would give the tip to the new party to attack the government. In other words, he envisioned himself as the master puppeteer who could determine when and where the opposition would attack. He claimed that he wanted democracy, but insisted it be the real, not the fake, not the American type, adding, "I have to have some choice." In the course of these meetings, the Shah lamented the nature of politics, dirty as one has to tell lies and enter into all kinds of deals with all kinds of people, and the spiritual and moral corruption everywhere. For reasons that are not clear, the only country the Shah excluded from his harsh judgment was Austria. One can surmise that his love of the country might have been rooted in the fact that his physician for many years had been Austrian. He emphasized that his goal was building up self-confidence and self-respect in the people, a belief in their own power and ability, to fight the tendency of the people, especially the youth, to deny, to denigrate, to reject. In their third meeting, Sami indicated that if he was to build an institution and could, in crisis, when time comes for succession, be helpful in maintaining the constitution, then he would need some concessions. There would need to be serious dialogue with students and youth in general, he said. The Shah curtly dismissed the idea, adding that he did not think they had very much to say. The most heated debate took place over the question of what to do about the clergy. Sami said, with surprising frankness, that at that time religion seems to provide the only channel of protest, and that Shiism had become merely a political instrument. Nonetheless, he noted that religious leaders, even if they were stooges of communism, must be listened to. The Shah was skeptical and said that to try to treat with an Ockhound cleric was like going to bed with a madman. He nevertheless said that he was concerned that in modern societies, religion was necessary to provide stability. Eventually, the Shah agreed to allow Sami to establish contact with the clergy, but insisted that no concessions were to be made, and added that there was no need to mention the idea of dialogue with the clergy in the party manifesto. The Shah's approach to religion was contradictory. He encouraged the growth of mosques and other religious institutions, but particularly after 1963 was altogether opposed to the idea of listening to the clergy, much less making concessions to them, even if they were moderate clergy who were opposed to Khomeini. By the time he changed his mind in 1978 and tried to solicit the support of such clergy, it was far too late. Khomeini was the undoubted leader of the vast network of religious organizations and forces, and moderate clerics did not dare openly criticize or challenge him. The Shah and Sami agreed that the party would first bring together 10 of the country's most reputable technocrats, intellectuals, and politicians as its founding members. The number would then increase to 60. One of the 10 was picked by Sami not because of his credentials, but for his close ties to the Shah. This way, Sami believed, the Shah would always know exactly what we were up to, and hopefully this would alleviate his anxieties. The Shah assured Sami that the proposed new party could participate in elections and even negotiate with other opposition forces. Of course, as he repeated more than once, it would be he who would guide the party and give it the cue. Sami talked of endemic corruption, the need for an independent judiciary, the necessity for suspending military tribunals, civilian control of the military. On none of these issues did he receive satisfactory answers from the Shah. 4 years later, under duress, the Shah accepted these changes and many other demands of the opposition. It is difficult not to wonder what might have happened to Iran if the Shah had made some of these concessions to Sami while in a position of strength, rather than to the opposition 4 years later when he was weak and vulnerable. But then one day the founding member Sami had included because of his ties to the Shah suddenly resigned. Sami immediately realized that the Shah had had a change of heart, and with some trepidation, on the last day of the Persian year in 1974, he went to the court. The Shah began the discussion by lamenting his weight loss of 7 kilos in the last week, a sign of his still secret disease. Then a tearful Semi suggested that he must resign from the task of forming this party. The Shah accepted the resignation all too readily. What he started with a private bang ended with a whimper. The Semi project might have been the Shah's last chance to create an institution that he knew his regime needed if there was to be a peaceful, orderly transition, or if his country faced a crisis. The fact that the price of oil had suddenly quadrupled appeared to be a key factor in the Shah's change of mind. Instead of a legitimate party led by Sami, he opted instead for the development of a one-party system. All other parties were dismantled in favor of the new Rastaki's Resurgence Party. The Shah, his two hands jutting from the vest, in an attempt to appear authoritative, declared in a national broadcast press conference that everyone must join the new party and that those who refuse should leave the country. The Resurgence Party of 1975 was a stillborn monster and an immediate source of discontent, even ridicule. The key party ideologues were mostly from the ranks of lapsed Stalinists, mixing bad ideas with bad politics. Even Hoveyda, the first appointed Secretary General of the party, often ridiculed it in private, while in public professing fealty to the idea and to the Shah. How the Shah came up with the idea of a one-party system for Iran is hard to pinpoint. On numerous occasions, including in his first memoir, and even as late as his conversations with Sami, he had underscored his opposition to single-party systems, describing them as harbingers of totalitarianism. Some believe the idea for the party first came to the Shah from Anwar al-Sadat in Egypt. Others point the finger to a group of 5 mostly American-trained technocrats who were part of the Queen's think tank, and who suggested the one-party system based on Samuel Huntington's prescription for political development in developing countries. The Shah initially rejected the group's proposal, asking in anger, "Haven't they read my book?" By then, in a gesture reminiscent of leaders like Mao, the court had produced a handsome edition of the Shah's collected works. The collection is indeed replete with statements against one-party systems. Others think the Shah took his cues on the single-party system from Mexico. The Shah had first toyed with the idea of a single party in the early 1960s and had spoken of it intermittently in the subsequent years. In each case, he had walked away from the idea, but this time without any consultation with anyone, including the Prime Minister, Sabak Alam, or the Queen. He announced the creation of the new one-party system at a press conference. A few days earlier, he had told Abdul Majidi, director of the Plan Organization, of his decision. The Shah was at the time vacationing in St. Moritz. The Majidi rushed to a public phone in the Savretta Hotel to inform Hoveyda that the days of his Iran Novin were now numbered. During this press conference, the Shah not only announced the creation of a single party, but appointed a clearly surprised Hoveyda as its first secretary. The idea was a disaster. It failed to increase political participation, as the Shah and the Queen's think tank kept promising, but instead became a political albatross that created nothing but discontent. The fierce battle between Hoveyda and Alam to dominate the party led to further paralysis. Each man had by then a number of lapsed Marxists among his staff, and each tried to place their theorists in places of authority. It mattered little to the Shah or to the men and women who eagerly, albeit cynically, served in the new party that the idea of limiting political activity to one party was against the letter and spirit of the Constitution. By then, the Shah's words were the law, and party theorists and activists competed for a chance to develop a party platform and ideology commensurate with the Shah's desires and designs. One of the most incredible of these party theorists was Professor Ahmad Fardid, the man who introduced Martin Heidegger to Iran and developed a sophisticated anti-Semitism narrative that nourished the paranoia of young people like Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Soon after the fall of the Shah, the same Fardid became one of the most notorious advocates of the new regime, using Heideggerian mumbo-jumbo to legitimize the despotic rule of the clergy. The Shah had strangely ordered the new party ideology to be based on dialectics, which opened the door for both lapsed Marxists and Heideggerian anti-Semites to legitimately leave their dialectical mark on the party. Not long after the creation of the party, the Carter administration came to power and began to pressure the Shah to democratize and show more respect for human rights. Carter's choice of William Sullivan as the new ambassador to Iran in June 1977 was for some of the Shah's aides the first hint of trouble. Sullivan had served in South Asia, where he had developed a reputation as a tamer of dictators. But he knew nothing about Iran, as he readily admits in his own memoirs. Ardashir Zahidi, who was Iran's ambassador to the United States at the time, recommended that the Shah refuse to issue the required agreement for Sullivan's appointment. But the Shah rejected the idea. We should not, he told Zahidi, pick a fight with Carter so early in his presidency. Ironically, so incompetent was Sullivan in the performance of his duties, and so different were his ideas from those of the White House, that before 2 years Jimmy Carter too wanted to recall him. But by then the damage had been done. The Cy Vance, the Secretary of State, opposed the idea of a recall. The issue, that might be pronounced Cy Vance, Cy Vance, I'm not sure. The issue of human rights was not the only sore spot in U.S. relations with Iran. In the last years of the Nixon administration and throughout the Ford administration, the two countries had been fighting an open, often bitter war of diplomacy on the price of oil and on Iran's nuclear program. When the Shah refused to use his influence in OPEC to reduce the price of oil, the United States made a covert pact with Saudi Arabia to bring it down. The Shah claims that this refusal, and not a democratic aspirations of the people, was the real source of his downfall. Some scholars agree that the sudden drop in oil prices indeed contributed to the fall of the Shah. Just as Iran's revenues were drastically reduced with this drop in the price of oil, the Carter administration resumed pressure on the Shah to democratize and liberalize. In one of his earliest meetings with the Shah, Sullivan told him that, according to his preliminary inquiries, Iran's current rate of rapid economic development could not be maintained. The Shah was visibly shaken and ended the meeting prematurely. For a couple of weeks he refused to meet with Sullivan again. He saw the comment as a clear indication that the Carter administration was unhappy with Prime Minister Hoveyda. Sullivan claims that he had no such intentions. Nevertheless, a few days after this embittered meeting, Hoveyda was dismissed, and Jashid Amuzagar was appointed Prime Minister. Amuzagar began his tenure with a serious handicap, for he had no choice but to implement an austerity program. He was nevertheless initially remarkably successful in the economic management of the country, reducing internal inflation from over 30% a year to about 10%. He injected a measure of realism in the people's expectations. But in the political domain, he was deemed a failure, a loner, who never established an easy working relationship with the Shah. He was bereft of charisma and incapable of engendering any popularity. Finally, his handling or lack of handling of the religious leadership and their followers was little short of disastrous. He either ignored them or at best made perfunctory appearances at religious ceremonies. In the eyes of some royalists, Amuzagar's austerity program, Amuzagar's auster oh my god. In the eyes of some royalists, Amuzagar's austerity program included cutting the stipends the government secretary paid the clergy. It was these stipends that, according to this theory, assured the clergy's support of the regime. For many, cutting these stipends was the single most important source of the revolution. For almost 15 years after the revolution, Amuzagar kept silent about this allegation. He finally chose to clear the air in 1994 when he claimed that money had been paid directly to the clergy by the White House since 1953, and that it was Carter, not he, who cut the stipends. In reality, stipends to the clergy were minimal and were handled mostly by the court or by Savak. Even more crucially, these who accepted these handouts were usually not amongst Khomeini's supporters, as Nasser Azhar, the long-serving Hoveda liaison with the clergy, made clear. Radical clergy never deigned to take our money. More crucial than clerical stipends was the country's economic reality. By 1978, Iran's GNP growth in real terms dropped to 2.8%. This economic slowdown was exacerbated by unusually high inflation rates. Like much of the West, Iran faced the strange hybrid phenomenon of stagflation. Some in the U.S. Congress began to worry about Iran's budgetary priorities, and the fact that, in line with the Shah's views, precedence was given to military matters over social needs. These anxieties led to the concept of linking Iran's human rights performance with arms transfer. Politically, too, Amuzagar was fighting an uphill battle. In 1977, the dismissal of Hoveda as prime minister, a post he had held for almost 14 years, longer than any other minister in Iran's constitutional period, signaled to the opposition the end of an era. Some saw it as the beginning of the end of the Shah. Footnote. In those days, I was a political prisoner in Evin. Some of the future leaders of the Islamic Republic, from Rafsanjani to Montazeri, were my block mates. They refused, as a matter of principle, to watch television. The only time they broke their self-imposed taboo was the night Hoveda's resignation was announced. End of footnote. As Carter's human rights policy went into effect, the opposition began to constantly test the waters with the regime and pushed for more and more freedom. Even this inauspicious constellation of the stars was not enough to end the Shah's regime. In the last 2 years of his rule, at each critical moment, the Shah arguably made the worst possible choice. He showed weakness when he needed to show strength, and he feigned power when he had none. The reasons for this remarkable series of errors were personal and political, and they were rooted not only in the Shah's storied vacillations, but also in his view that the whole movement was a conspiracy of outside forces against him. He changed his mind about who masterminded the conspiracy, but he never wavered in his belief that conspiracy was the causal root of the democratic movement. In his last book, Answer to History, written in exile long after he had been unkinged, the Shah still argued with disturbing certainty that it was a conspiracy of Western and communist forces that overthrew him. He argued that to understand the upheaval in Iran, one must understand the politics of oil. He went on to claim that as soon as he began to insist on a fair share of oil wealth for Iran, a systematic campaign for denigration was begun concerning my government and my person. It was at this time that I became a despot, an oppressor, a tyrant. What the Shah failed to understand was that it was in fact the democratic aspirations of the Iranian people that begot the movement against him, and that ironically his own social and economic policies of the 1960s and 1970s helped create the very social forces, particularly the middle class and the new technocratic class, that united to overthrow him. Even if Western or communist powers were indeed conspiring against him, their plans worked only because there was fertile domestic ground for them. Even when the Shah looked for domestic causes of the revolution, he was under an illusion. Today, I've come to realize that the events of 1978 to 79 were attributable in part to the fact that I moved too rapidly in opening the doors of the universities without imposing more severe preliminary selection. The entrance exams were too easy. He called the students spoiled children who helped wreak havoc on Iran. In another passage, he contemplated the idea of having agreed to the military's proposed bloodletting. The blood that had been shed since the revolution, he said, has been incomparably greater than the most egregious plans of his military. The Shah dismissed nearly every form of opposition to his rule as a tool of Western governments to bring pressure on him. In 1977, as the democratic movement was picking up momentum, he ordered some of his top oil negotiators to meet with Western oil companies and give them what they want. In the months leading up to the revolution, he was desperately trying to understand what the United States and Britain wanted of him. He called to court political figures he knew had close ties to the two governments. He asked Ahmad Qureshi, a scion of an aristocratic family and a close friend of Richard Helms and Homayoun Sanat-Itzadeh, also reported close to the U.S. government, as much in anxiety as in anger. What do these Americans want of us? That would be Homayoun Sanat-Itzadeh. Just for clarity, I guess. Aside from this belated decision to liberalize, the second root of the revolution was tied to the nature of the Shah's character. Ironically, his strength of character as a man was his weakness as a leader. In the 1960s and 1970s, he increasingly took on the persona of an absolute leader, decisive and determined, even brash and brutal. But no sooner did the dark clouds of crisis appear on the horizon than he began to lose his resolve, and all the vacillations and weaknesses that had almost ended his rule in 1953 appeared once again. The once defiant Shah, who had hectored the President of the United States and haughtily dismissed the elder statesmen of his realm as useless reactionaries, was now in desperate need of advice, not only from these same elders, but from the British and American embassies. He made virtually no decision in the last year without first seeking advice from these divergent sources. And contradictory advice often begot either indecision or actions that were, in retrospect, blatantly absurd and sure recipes for disaster. As the crisis continued, the Shah grew more desperate for signs of support from the West, particularly from the United States. But the messages he got from America were contradictory. For example, when concerned Iranians asked Ambassador Sullivan if he would seek a personal message of support for the Shah from President Carter, Sullivan fobbed the Shah off by saying that such a message would be unusual and inappropriate at the present time. The response depressed the Shah. A few weeks later, the Shah was told that he would in fact be receiving a telephone call from the president. According to Sullivan, the Shah was clearly delighted. His chin moved from his knees to at least his chest. In reality, there were profound contradictions in the directions the American embassy was receiving from the White House, the National Security Council, and the State Department. The confusion and bitter bureaucratic infighting created a vacuum wherein Sullivan followed his own foreign policy, while Zbigniew Brzezinski, the national security advisor, suggested using an iron fist to establish law and order, followed by rational concessions to the opposition. The State Department under Cyrus Vance insisted on the continuation of the liberalization policy. Henry Precht, in charge of the Iran desk at the State Department in this period, was also an avid supporter of liberalization. The Shah considered him nothing less than a foe. In an interview, he calls Precht that son of a bitch McGovernite and faults him for some of the confusion in U.S. foreign policy. Carter himself constantly vacillated between these two starkly different paradigms. Sullivan, too, was dancing to an increasingly bizarre tune. His self-admitted ignorance of Iranian history and Islamic traditions, which was source of wonderment when he was first appointed, now came back to haunt him. The Shah swung from one extreme to another, invariably to disastrous result. Khomeini, dangling a tactical but tantalizing democratic platform, used each of the Shah's moves to his own profit, ultimately convincing Sullivan that he would create a democratic party in Iran. Not only were Khomeini's cohorts in direct contact with the embassy in Tehran, but Sullivan supported the idea of the United States establishing ties with Khomeini himself in Paris. According to Carter, Sullivan lost complete control of himself when he learned that the United States had approached Khomeini through the French instead of directly as he had pushed. As Almuzagar proved unable to control the crisis, the Shah decided to replace him. In his answer to history, he laments the fact that he moved too quickly. Following Almuzagar's dismissal, the Shah decided to create a government of national reconciliation and chose Jafar Sharif Amami for the task. He had been the president of the Senate for almost 2 decades and had led the Shah's Pahlavi Foundation ever since its creation, overseeing the expansion of the foundation into different fields of the economy, from owning and operating every casino and most luxury hotels in the country to purchasing the Omran Bank, one of the most powerful financial institutions in the country. In 1961, during his first term as Prime Minister, Not only had he failed miserably in dealing with the severe recession, but the U.S. Embassy considered him responsible for some of the plunders which had gone on. Since that time, he had been known for harboring anti-American sentiments. He had also acquired the moniker of Mr. 5%, based on the allegation that he received 5% on every major government contract. On top of all this, he was generally known to be the Grand Master of Masonic lodges in Iran, a fact confirmed when Esmail Rain published his famous 3-volume study of Masons in Iran. In other words, it is hard to imagine a figure worse suited to the job of forming a government of national reconciliation than Jafar Sharif Amami. But he had several things working in his favor. First and foremost, some of the clergy, particularly Ayatollah Shariat Madari, had suggested him as a possible candidate to replace Amuzegar. It was a measure of the radical mood of the times that although Shariat Madari played a key role in bringing Sharif Amani to office, the atmosphere created a pro-Khomeini clergy was such that he did not dare offer public support. He decided instead on caution, deliberately refraining from allowing himself to be identified with the new cabinet. Sharif Amami also had the support of the British Embassy, according to the British ambassador. He was a well-respected figure, a former prime minister, and of impeachable religious credentials. According to the British ambassador, he was a well-respected figure, a former prime minister, and of impeccable religious credentials. By this point, the Shah was growing less and less involved in the daily affairs of government. Sharif Amami's strategy was simple enough. He made concessions to every demand of the opposition, sometimes anticipating what those might be, and offering the concession even before the demand was made. The calendar was changed back to its Islamic origin. The casinos were shut down. Some political prisoners were freed, while dozens of ministers, generals, and key officials were arrested. The most controversial of these was the arrest of Amir Abbas Hoveyda on November 7, 1978. Ostensibly the Shah, the Queen, and 5 highly placed advisors decided on his arrest that day. However, the Shah had informed the British ambassador a week earlier about the imminent arrest of both Hoveyda and Nematollah Nasari, who had only recently been appointed Iran's ambassador to Pakistan. Under General Moghadam's leadership at Savak, censorship virtually ended. Hundreds of political prisoners were freed. Criticism of the government was not just allowed but encouraged. But it was all to no avail. As far as the opposition was concerned, Sharif Amami's concessions were nothing but a sign of weakness. Some in Savak had a very different view of how to handle the situation. On Saturday, May 13, 1978, all chiefs of security and police were called to Tehran for a conference. Nazari, still Savak chief, put forth the view that the way to handle the disturbances was to close the bazaars in cities such as Qom and use all the necessary force, including killing people. But General Fardast, also present at the meeting, presented an alternative approach more congruent with what became Sharif Amami's mode of behavior. Fardast argued that military conscripts could not be counted on or carry out such a crackdown. He recommended instead that the government open a dialogue with the people. As Fardast himself admitted, his views were adopted by those in the room only because they assumed he was speaking for the Shah. The meeting ended by those present asking Fardas to convey to the Shah their concurrence with the position he advocated. But these concessions only increased the opposition appetite for more. Eventually, on September 7, 1978, faced with increasing riots and strikes, the cabinet decided to declare martial law in Tehran. For reasons that have never been fully explained, the announcement of martial law, though made in early afternoon, was not broadcast until after midnight. By 8 o'clock the next morning, some 800 people had congregated in Jallah Square. Within an hour, that number swelled to about 10,000. Soldiers tried to enforce the curfew, asking the demonstrators to disperse. Then tear gas and live ammunition were used. The city was suddenly awash with rumors of thousands killed by soldiers. According to the foreign embassies, the actual number was anywhere from a dozen to 300. What the hell is that? The day was immediately labeled Black Friday, and Sharif Amami experiment in appeasement had failed. It is hard to pinpoint the moment at which the unwieldy coalition that eventually overthrew the Shah began to coalesce. One thing is certain: Carter's human rights policies had an impact in reinvigorating the dormant democratic movement. Many consider the trigger to have been an ill-advised article that was published in Etela in January 1978. The article, titled Iran and the Red and Black Colonialism, had grown out of the Shah's anger at Khomeini's latest, particularly nasty pronouncements against the Pahlavi dynasty. He had called the Shah a filthy pilferer of public coffers. Khomeini's eldest son had died, and rumors of Savak's involvement, though never confirmed even by Khomeini, spread throughout the country. An angry Shah ordered Savak and Hoveyda, then court minister, to prepare a blistering attack. Savak was, rightly as it turned out, reluctant to stir up a hornet's nest. Hoveyda, on the other hand, was more than eager to carry out the Shah's orders. He had two of his journalistic hacks prepare the article. Some claim that Hoveyda's eagerness stemmed from his enmity toward Almozegar and a lingering hope of a return to power. Whatever the reason for Hoveyda's eagerness, the two journalists, both notorious for their opportunism, speedily prepared a scurrilous attack on Khomeini. It combined fact and fiction, accusing Khomeini of being of Indian origins and of being a British agent. The fact that his grandfather had moved to India was later confirmed by his brother and his biographers. But in those days, the article was seen as a sinister character assassination. Darius Homayoun, then Minister of Information, Darius Homayoun, then Minister of Information, received a yellow envelope embossed with the seal of the royal court. He had already been informed that it contained an article the Shah wanted published. Without reading the article, Homayoun sent it to Eteliyat and asked them to publish it forthwith. But upon reading the text, both the editor and the publisher of the daily paper realized its incendiary potential. They called Homayoun to register their reservations. Prime Minister Almozegar was consulted, and he too, without bothering to read the essay, ordered it published. "If His Majesty wants something published," Almozegar reportedly said, "then it shall be published." Almozegar was, of course, not alone in this sentiment. For years, Hoveyda had ensured the implementation of his orders by insisting they were from the boss, Arbab. The article was published on January 8th on page 7 of Italiat, and within hours riots began to erupt in the city of Qum, and blood was shed. Wiser Ayatollahs like Shariat Madari knew the dangers inherent in his hornet's nest. He immediately contacted the court and suggested that the Shah swiftly issue an apology and bring to a speedy close the unfolding eruption. But Shariat Madari's wise suggestion was ignored, and within days even he had no choice but to join the increasingly loud chorus of critics of the regime, all demanding an apology. As the movement in support of Khomeini gathered steam, Saddam Hussein offered as a gesture of goodwill to rid the Shah of his meddlesome priests. The Shah refused, suggesting that killing Khomeini would only make him a martyr. Apparently, the French intelligence services made a similar offer to the Shah, and his response was the same. Also, according to Iran's ambassador to Iraq at the time, a few months before this sudden eruption, someone in Khomeini's entourage had inquired about the possibility of the Ayatollahs returning to Iran to die. The Shah had summarily rejected the request. Others believe the first salvo of the 1979 revolution was a 124-page open letter to the Shah that was written in 1977 by the famous journalist Ali Asghar Haj Sayyid Javadi, in which he detailed the breaches of law committed by the government, the court, and the Shah himself. Some point to the 10 nights of poetry at the Goethe Institute in Tehran as the genesis of the movement. On those nights, some of the country's leading dissidents read works critical of the regime, its censorship, and its undemocratic ways. An estimated 10,000 people stood for hours in the open air, often in pouring rain, to listen to these dissident artists and intellectuals. In May 1977, 53 of the country's top lawyers and law professors wrote a letter to the Shah, accusing his government of interfering in the work of an independent judiciary. Less than a month later, 3 top leaders of the National Front, Karim Senjavi, Darius Forodhar, and Shapur Bakhtiar, wrote an open letter of their own to the Shah, criticizing the regime's economic policies and suggested that the mishandled land reform and subsequent bad policies had wrecked the country's agricultural sector. They demanded an end to despotism, respect for the Iranian Constitution and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, an end to the one-party system, freedom of the press, and release of all political prisoners. In quick order, other groups of lawyers, professors, and political activists entered the epistolary fight. In quick order, other groups of lawyers, professors, and political activists entered the epistolary fight for democracy. One of the most important of these letters was signed by 98 prominent writers, poets, and translators. It marked the reemergence of the Iranian Writers Association, a group that played an important role in the subsequent democratic struggle in Iran. With every passing day, as it became evident that the regime was no longer punishing those who signed these daring declarations, their numbers suddenly increased. The Iranian Committee for the Defense of Freedom and Human Rights was founded, and in its ranks were not only most leaders of the National Front, but also Mehdi Bazargan, the future prime minister of the Islamic regime. Ironically, what fed the appetite of these critics was the Shah's decision to establish 2 royal commissions to look into allegations of mismanagement and malfeasance. Ironically, what fed the appetite of these critics was the Shah's decision to establish 2 royal commissions to look into allegations of mismanagement and malfeasance. in the Hoveyda government. Some of the journalists known for their ties to the court also began surprisingly acerbic attacks on Hoveyda. Ali Asghar Amirani, the famous editor of Kandaniya, was easily the most noticeable of such newly emboldened critics. It is hard to imagine that the attacks were not sanctioned by the Shah. Whatever the reason, these attacks only fanned the flames of discontent among the people and weakened the resolve of the royalists. If loyal servants like Hoveyda and Nasiri could be arrested, no member of the ancient regime was safe. A massive flight of capital began as individuals and their fortunes sought safe harbor in Europe and the United States. Those who chose to stay and try to save the regime ended up paying a heavy price, sometimes with their lives, for their fidelity to the Shah or the country. The findings of the royal commissions, some of them broadcast on radio and television, seem to further confirm opposition claims of massive fraud and misuse of public funds. Nasrallah Monian, the Shah's impeccably honest chief of staff for about 2 decades, was in charge of one of the commissions. The findings did not offer a complimentary picture of the country's economic realities. Despite the role his own policies had in creation of the crisis, the Shah felt betrayed, not only by the West, but also by the people of Iran. Sometimes he accused his opponents of being nothing but Marxists, terrorists, lunatics, and criminals. When in October 1978 he finally took a helicopter flight to witness one of the most massive demonstrations, he came back despondent, angry, and convinced of foreign connivance. That night he met with British and American officials and told them in no uncertain terms that he held their governments responsible for what he had seen that morning. "What have I done to you?" he asked. He believed that the West's betrayal of him far exceeded the giveaway at Yalta. In 1978, the Shah and most Iranian government officials had an exaggerated view of the power of America and Great Britain to direct events in Iran. A few critical reports by the BBC and the American media were more than enough to convince both the people and the regime that the Shah was now vulnerable and that the West had not only abandoned him, but was now out to get him. Even Khomeini reportedly listened to nightly broadcasts of A Voice of America, the BBC and Radio Israel to get a sense of Western policy. So pervasive was the belief that the American and British media, particularly the BBC and the Voice of America, represented the official views of their governments, that after a few critical reports in both outlets, both countries' ambassadors felt compelled to try to dispel the notion. Nonetheless, more than once, Iran semi-officially objected to the British government about the content of BBC broadcasts, even threatening to end some contracts with British companies. The BBC in particular was deemed to be so powerful and its influences so pernicious that some of the Shah's generals from the Air Force suggested using the cover of night to take out and the relay towers of the BBC. In recent accounts offered by the BBC itself, they admit to having had a critical disposition towards the Shah. They write that the image of BBC changed in the collective perception of the population. It was no longer the voice of British colonialism, but a trusted friend. They attributed this anti-Shah tilt to the personal inclinations of their staff, and not to some coordinated British government policy. Tensions over these broadcasts reached such a level that in September 1978, Sir Anthony Parsons, the British ambassador, informed the Shah and Prime Minister Sharif Amami of his decision to dispatch an entirely trustworthy emissary to meet with Ayatollah Shariat Madari as leader of the most important moderate opposition, and reassure him that the BBC did not reflect official British policy and that Great Britain's true position was in fact full support for the Shah. The US government took similar steps to reassure the Shah that in spite of what the American media reported, the American government continued to support him. Like a traditional Oriental potentate, the Shah the Shah felt the society owed him a debt of gratitude for the progress and the freedoms he had given them. And in fact, in the last 15 years of his rule, there had been not only unprecedented economic growth, but unparalleled cultural and religious freedom in Iran. Double-digit growth of the GNP was not the exception, but the rule. Iran ranked with Turkey, South Korea, and Taiwan as the countries that were industrializing most rapidly and were most likely to join the ranks of developed economies. But for most in Iran's opposition, these cultural and economic freedoms and accomplishments were either a form of decadent libertinism or a mere cosmetic to cover the more fundamental lack of democracy. On the eve of the revolution, it was political freedom that was the focus of the opposition's demands. And in one of the great ironies of modern history, this movement chose as its leader the man most likely to severely curtail the cultural and political freedom people were demanding. Moreover, most Iranians, touched by modernity and its notions about the natural rights of citizens, considered the freedoms the Shah thought he was giving them their inalienable rights. They held him responsible for having deprived them of these rights and resented the fact that he expected them to show gratitude for their newly bestowed freedoms. The Shah felt, in the words of a confidant, like a man who had lavished everything on a beautiful woman for years, only to find that she had been unfaithful all along. The authoritarian system he had established made him the sole decider for nearly every major economic, political, and military decision in the country, whether it was the decision to allow visas for an American university marching band or the precise timing of the arrest of a known Soviet spy. He expected to have the final say. When his deteriorating health and his anxious mood, and more importantly, his failing grip on power, rendered him incapable or unwilling to make any decisions, as happened in late 1978, the weakness and vacillations that had been the hallmark of his character in his battle with Mossadegh re-emerged, and the entire machinery of the state came to a grinding halt. The Mossadegh mystique also affected both the Shah and his supporters, who mistakenly believed that the United States must have some master plan to keep the Shah, or at least the monarchy, in power. But unbeknownst to the Shah, by early November 1978, both the British and American embassies had concluded that doing another August 1953 to save the Shah was not in their interest. Moreover, in 1953, the Shah had the support of the army, much of the entrepreneurial class, and the top echelon of the clergy, as well as the full trust and relentless effort of a capable minister of court, who spared no effort to save the throne. In 1978, however, everything was different. The clergy were either against him or cowed by Khomeini's radicalism, unwilling to publicly support him. The entrepreneurial class was in utter disarray, and had long ago been forced to abandon any political ambition. Even the ranks of the military had been showing, from early September 1978, signs of discontent, if not outright rebellion. By December 1978, the British and American embassies were both detecting signs of dissension and disarray at the top of the armed forces. Commanders complained that the Shah was bereft of purpose, suggesting that his father had been made of sterner metal, and that such a crisis would have never accepted under Reza Shah. In the weeks before the collapse of the regime, American officials, cognizant of these facts, tried to establish new ties to the opposition. They wanted to avoid a civil war, which would have benefited the Soviets. They also wanted to ensure that the communists would not use chaos as a pretext to seize power. British and U.S. policy began to shift. On October 30th, 1978, British Prime Minister James Callaghan's office decided that the Shah did not have any chance of surviving and informed the Foreign Office that they should start thinking about reinsuring. Around the same time, the Carter administration also concluded that the Shah was not likely to survive. General Robert Heuser, sent by Carter on a special mission to Iran, and General Gast, the MAAG Military Assistance and Advisory Group chief in Tehran, were in close touch with the military and were working to facilitate contact between them and Khomeini's forces. The decision to work with Khomeini and his forces came after contacts were established between him and American officials in Paris. After some initial trepidation, the United States decided to learn more about Khomeini's plans. He in Paris and his supporters in Tehran were asked to answer a series of questions. The responses were, according to U.S. officials, of the standard Third World type. There was clearly no hint of clerical despotism. In the meantime, even the American embassy in Tehran arrived at a new reading of Shi'ism. Sullivan not only wrote about thinkable and the unthinkable. In the meantime, even the American embassy in Tehran arrived at a new reading of Shi'ism. Sullivan not only wrote about thinking the unthinkable and planning for an Iran without the Shah, but also concluded that Khomeini was keen on establishing a democracy in Iran. The United States began facilitating Khomeini's rise to power. The movement that overthrew the Shah was democratic in nature and aspirations. Some 11% of the 38 million people of Iran participated in the movement, compared to 7% in the French Revolution and 9% in the Russian Revolution. The slogans of the day were unmistakably democratic as well. 38 to 50% were directed against the Shah himself. 16 to 30% favored Khomeini personally. At most, 38% asked for an Islamic republic. None asked for a clerical regime. The most common slogan was independence, freedom, and an Islamic republic. In the months leading up to the Western decision to reinsure Khomeini hid his ultimate goal and true ideology and took on the guise of democratic leader. Not only did he dissimulate when responding to the U.S. questionnaire, but in his more than 100 interviews in Paris, there was no mention of Velayat et Faqih. No mention of Velayat et Faqih. Whatever. But in fact, from his first book in Persian, written in the aftermath of the fall of Reza Shah, to the collection of his sermons on the Islamic government, compiled by his students in Najaf in the late 1960s, Khomeini consistently advocated the absolute rule of jurists enforcing Sharia law. Even in the annals of Shiite theology, Khomeini's view was deemed radical and was espoused by only a handful of ayatollahs. Ironically, he was aided in his deception by the fact that the Shah had banned Khomeini's books for decades, making them unavailable to Iranian readers or critics. To add further credibility to the democratic pose, Khomeini allowed a few ambitious Western-trained aides such as Abul Hassan Bani Sadek, Gotzadah, and Ibrahim Yatsi. Footnote. Today, Bani Sadr lives in exile after being impeached as the first president. Gotzadah was executed on the charge of plotting a coup, and Yazdi, the leader of the freedom movement, is in jail for his role in the 2009 post-election demonstrations. So again, to add further credibility to this democratic prose, Khomeini allowed a few ambitious Western-trained aides such as Abul Hassan Bani Sadr, Sadek, Gotzadah, and Ibrahim Yazdi to become the public face of his movement in Paris. The three were his de facto spokesmen and helped consolidate the democratic facade. At the same time, unbeknownst to the world, Khomeini had already organized a few trusted clerics in Tehran, nearly all had been his students in earlier years, into a covert revolutionary committee. Some members of this committee, particularly those from the freedom movement, were in close contact with American embassy officials in Tehran, and they eventually convinced the ambassador that the Islamic movement, dominated by Ayatollah Khomeini, is far better organized and enlightened and able to resist communism than its detractors would lead us to believe, and that it might be able to produce something more closely approaching westernized democratic processes than might at first be apparent. A more misguided reading of what Khomeini stood for is hard to imagine. For the Shah, the end seemed near when late in 1978 workers in the critical oil industry went on strike. In a remarkable lapse of planning, it turned out that Iran's much vaunted military lacked the technological or organizational know-how to take over the oil industry and keep the government afloat. By then, no country was deemed as central to deciding Iran's future as the United States. A U.S. Embassy memorandum written in 1978 on the eve of the revolution noted the secret hand theory deep in the Iranian grain, blames the U.S., among others, for Iran's many problems. George Ball, head of Carter's Special Task Force on Iran, wrote a report that captured these dynamics deftly. All parties are looking to the United States for signals. He wrote, "We made the Shah what he has become. We nurtured his love for grandiose geopolitical schemes and supplied him with the hardware to indulge his fantasies." Ball went on to say, "Now that his regime is coming apart under the pressures of imported modernization, the United States should pressure the Shah to give up much of his power and bring about a responsible government that not only meets the needs of the Iranian people, but the requirements of our own policy." After the Black Friday incident in September 1978, it was clear that Sharif Amami's experiment in shaming or appeasing the opposition into accord by offering them a surfeit of concessions had failed utterly. His decision to arrest prominent past leaders backfired, becoming a source of ridicule to the opposition and of wavering support in the rapidly dwindling ranks of royalist stalwarts. The Shah, after several meetings with British and American officials, and after accepting that his experiment with Sharif Amami had failed on November 5th, said there was now no choice but to impose a military government. It was time to flex the military muscle in order to intimidate the opposition. Earlier, Savak had submitted a list of about 1,500 people it wanted arrested. The plan was put forward to the Shah by Parviz Sabati, with Hoveyda, still court minister, acting as intermediary. With some trepidation, the Shah agreed to the arrest of 150 mostly less-known characters. After a couple of weeks, even those arrested were released on the order of the Prime Minister. By November, instead of implementing Savak's hard-knuckled plans, the Shah agreed to a massive purge of Savak itself. Sabeti was amongst those relieved of duty, and it became clear to the political cognoscenti that the Shah was ready to concede defeat. When rumors of the Shah's plan to install a military government spread, the opposition feared that General Ovesi When rumors of the Shah's plan to install a military government spread, the opposition feared that General Ovesi, nicknamed the Butcher of Tehran, would be at the head of the new military government. According to Aslan Ashafar, his chief of protocol, the Shah went so far as to tell orderlies that the court to summon Ovesi to his office. Then, according to Afshar, the British and American ambassadors asked for an emergency meeting with the Shah. After the meeting, a dour and dejected Shah told Afshar to cancel the summons to Ovesi. Instead, he appointed General Azhari, then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who was altogether bereft of charisma and the aura of intimidation needed in a military governor. Azhari had a hard time finding people willing to serve in his cabinet. On more than one occasion, it was left to the Shah to call and demand that someone accept the task for the love of the country. Hussein Najafi, one of the most respected jurists of his generation, was one such candidate. He had already served in the Sharif Amami cabinet, but was now unwilling to continue in the post, rightly arguing that he had a reputation as a jurist who followed the letter of the law. In a military cabinet, he said, you want someone to bring fear to the hearts of the people, not someone who will reassure them of the law's full implication. But the Shah would not relent, and at his insistence, a reluctant Najafi was named Minister of Justice. Even if General Azhari's own timid behavior and the incongruent mix of his cabinet ministers was not enough to deprive it of its aura of authority or military menace, the Shah's notorious speech the day before his appointment was the last nail in the coffin of the military option. The controversial speech was by all accounts prepared by two of the Queen's closest advisers, Sayyid Hassan Nazar and Reza Qutbi, by then the Shah's speechwriter of many years. Shujaddin Shafa had already left Iran, and contrary to rumor, had no rule in preparing the speech. Had I been in Iran, he said, I would have never allowed His Majesty to make such an ill-advised speech. On the morning of this infamous speech, on November 5th, 1978, when the Shah arrived at his office and noticed the television crew setting up, he asked his chief of staff what they were preparing for. He was told that a speech was on its way from the Queen's office. When the Shah finally saw a draft, he was reluctant to deliver it. Ultimately, after consultation with the Queen and her advisers, he was convinced, dressed in civilian clothes, bereft of any mark of majesty or authority, looking tired and wan, the Shah, for the first time, referred to the opposition movement as a revolution. I have heard the voice of your revolution, he said, adding that he fully realized that many errors had been committed in the past. Given a chance, he would now reign according to the letter of the Constitution, delivered only a day before the installation of the supposed military government. The repentant speech was yet another sign of the Shah's losing grip on the reins of power. The speech also indicated the rift that existed at the court between the Queen and her advisers, who consistently advocated reconciliation with the opposition and those advised the Shah to use his military to re-establish law and order. The vacillations between these two extremes only fed the opposition's appetite for power. If the repentant speech was intended to convince the opposition to join a government of national reconciliation, it was a complete failure. Most of the secular National Front leadership had decided by late 1978 against either forming a coalition with the Shah or forming a government of its own while the Shah was still in power. The National Front cannot be entirely blamed for the failure of a secular democratic coalition. The Shah had long been adamantly against reconciliation with the National Front, making vitriolic denunciations against them as late as June 1978 during a private meeting with British officials. He declared at the time that the National Front leaders were beyond the lines of political acceptability. Aside from these old political wounds that made a compromise with the Shah more difficult was the tragic fire in the Rex Cinema in the city of Abadan. On August 19, 1978, doors to the theater were locked from outside and the place was set ablaze. More than 400 people burned to death. The regime tried to accuse the Islamists of instigating the murderous act, while the opposition claimed that it was in fact the regime that had burned the theater to tarnish the opposition's reputation. In subsequent years, it has become increasingly more evident that it was in fact radical Islamists who put the Rex Cinema ablaze. As the tempo of anti-Shah demonstrations increased, some American businessmen working in Iran decided to level a public relations campaign in support of the Shah. More importantly, some members of the Iranian bourgeois class, finally cognizant of the imminent danger to their investments and way of life, belatedly tried to organize pro-Shah groups and demonstrations. The effort was led primarily by Ali Reza, the head of a major industrial conglomerate. He had been in close contact with Princess Ashraf, who encouraged the group to act. In a meeting attended by some of the country's top industrialists, almost 20 million tumen, 3 million, was raised. But like most of what the Shah supporters did, it was too late. It was too little, too late. In retrospect, it seems likely that the Shah's last chance for survival was the appointment of Ghulam Hussein Siddiqui as Prime Minister. He had been an interior minister during Mossadegh's time and remained unwavering in his support for the man he called the ultimate leader. The Shah had been instrumental in arranging for his early release from prison in the aftermath of August 1953. He is a patriot, the Shah reportedly declared at the time. A revered professor at Tehran University, Siddiqui was considered the father of modern sociology in Iran. He was renowned for his mastery of Aristotelian text and was also one of the leaders of the National Front, having played a pivotal role in revitalizing the front in the early 1960s. He remained unbending in his opposition to the Shah, who he considered a coup-installed illegitimate claimant to the throne. In what will go down in history as a remarkable show of courage, Siddiqui decided to forego his personal animosities when he felt the country was in danger. In early October as it became clear that only a genuine government of national reconciliation might save the country from Khomeini, Sadeghi finally agreed to meet with the Shah. He had only two conditions. The first meeting would take place with at least two other trusted elder statesmen present, and there should be no discussion of an appointment as prime minister in that meeting. The Shah agreed, and the first meeting was spent on general discussion of both the past and the current crisis. When the Shah claimed that he had the full support of President Carter in his decision to leave the country for a while, Sadeghi stopped him. It was, he said, unbecoming to a king to worry about the support of an American president. Moreover, he insisted that, in his view, the idea of the Shah's leaving Iran at the time was ill-advised. This surprised the Shah. All the other National Front leaders he had met wanted him to leave the country. All in all, there were 5 meetings between the Shah and Sadeghi. In the second meeting, on December 10th, only the Shah and Sadeghi were present, and it was then that the job of prime minister was offered to the prudent old Aristotelian. His most critical demand was that the Shah remain in Iran. He also demanded that the bloodshed stop. He then promised to work on forming a cabinet. A few days earlier, the Shah had also met with Karim Sanjabi, the leader of the National Front. Sanjabi predicated his acceptance of any role in a government on Khomeini's prior approval. He had just returned from the meeting with Khomeini in Paris, where he had made a statement the Ayatollah had refused to sign, lest the presumptive leader of the secular forces develop any delusions that he was on par with Khomeini, in which he not only accepted Khomeini's leadership, but also the increasing role of Islam in shaping the ideology of the movement. Upon his return to Tehran, Sanjabi told the Shah that no solution would work without a green light from Khomeini. He added that at present this was impossible to obtain except on the basis of the Shah's total abdication. More incredibly still, he suggested that the present military government should remain in office for another couple of months to see if Khomeini's influence might be on the decline, and if a situation might then obtain where some kind of a national government could be formed. A more dangerous combination of cowardice and mendacity is hard to imagine. Ali Amini, another credible candidate for the job of prime minister, was, in the Shah's words, on a different tack. His proposal was that the Shah would withdraw to Bandar Abbas in the south, and that a monarchical council should be set up which would carry out all the functions of the monarchy except the command of the armed forces, which would remain with the Shah. In those days, Tehran had become a virtual circus full of political lightweights, with delusions of grandeur, or political figures well past their prime, offering themselves to the Shah or to the British and American embassies as the sole savior, the country's messiah. Iraj Pezeshpour, the leader of the Pan-Iranist party, whose only hour of glory had been in the late 60s, was amongst those who met secretly with the Shah and offered him as a candidate for prime minister. A few weeks earlier, when the Shah had let it be known that Majlis deputies were free to speak their minds, Pezeshpour made what the British embassy called an inflammatory speech, establishing himself as a critic of the government. Clearly, however, he did not have the gravitas to tackle the crisis facing the country. Sadeghi remained the most credible candidate. National Front leaders of different hues all tried to convince Sadeghi not to accept the position, but he was altogether indifferent to the party machinations of his National Front comrades, each of whom was eager to deter Sadeghi for their own, often personal reasons. To those who appealed to this his lifelong reputation as a foe of the Shah and a friend of Mossadegh, he responded that the reputation he had achieved was not a private asset to be taken to the grave, but something I must use in the service of my country. The third meeting between the Shah and Sadeghi took place on December 25th, when Sadeghi laid out some of his plans. A final resolution of the question of the Shah's properties in Iran and the radical change in Savak, though not its dissolution. He proposed an end to martial law, a reduction of the military budget, the appointment of General Feridun Jam as Minister of War, the dismissal of Zahedi as ambassador to the United States, an independent judiciary, and an end to military tribunals. The Shah agreed to nearly all these demands, offering some resistance on the military budget. "What are you going to do with Iraq?" he asked Sadeghi, insisted that his goal was not to weaken the military, but to make a temporary reduction to allow the government to survive the current economic crisis. Sadeghi reiterated his insistence that the Shah must stay in the country. He could go to the destination of his choice, for example, the Caspian coast of Kish Island, and appoint a committee that would act as a liaison between the cabinet and himself. Sadeghi knew that his survival depended on the support of the military, and that such support was dependent on the Shah's favorable disposition and his continued presence in the country. While the Shah waited to see whether Sadeghi could succeed in forming a cabinet, he told the American and British ambassadors that he had been thinking about what would happen if Sadeghi could not calm the situation. Then he said there would have to be a crackdown by the armed forces. There would be at that stage no choice between that course and surrender. The Shah further added that if it came to crackdown, he would not personally associate himself with it, and would withdraw to Bandar Abbas to visit his navy, while the army did its stuff. Ambassadors Parsons and Sullivan were both reluctant to support this contingency plan. Parsons said that he was not sure that the army would in fact carry out orders for such a crackdown. In certain areas they would refuse, and this would be disastrous. Clearly, the policy of Britain and the State Department was at the point to entourage the Shah's liberalization policy, eschew the use of the military against the people, and hope that in the end wiser counsels among the opposition will prevail, and bring some semblance of order to the domestic scene. 3 days later, Sadeghi met again with the Shah and reported that he had prepared a list of potential members of his cabinet. The only thing that was now required for his appointment was a vote of confidence by the Majlis and the Shah's final word. As far as I'm concerned, Sadeghi had on December 28th, I can begin work today. By then, in his legendary, meticulous manner, Sadeghi had prepared a plan of action, down to every hour. For his first weeks as Prime Minister, Khomeini proved unwilling to attack Sadeghi in public, and all that was needed was the Shah's final word. But, as Sadeghi knew, the Shah had been meeting with other candidates during these same weeks. On January 6, 1979, in what turned out to be the last meeting between a beleaguered Shah and a defiantly nationalist Sadeghi, the Shah talked of his meeting with Shapur Bakhtiar, another National Front leader, praising the latter as a brave nationalist man. Unlike Sadeghi, Bakhtiar had made it clear that he would accept the challenge of forming a cabinet only if the Shah agreed to leave the country. Clearly, for a distraught, angst-ridden Shah, who was by then taking 6 milligrams of chlorambucil as chemotherapy for his lymphoma, and at least 10 milligrams of Valium a day to calm his jittery nerves, the idea of leaving Iran might have been music to his ears. Clearly, for a distraught, angst-ridden Shah, who was by then taking 6 milligrams of chlorambucil as chemotherapy for his lymphoma, and at least 10 milligrams of Valium a day to calm his jittery nerves, the idea of leaving Iran might have been music to his ears. Nevertheless, why the Shah decided to reject Sadiji's plans and opt instead for Bakhtiar remains a mystery. Carter's White House diary provides some clues when he reports that Sullivan insisted that the Shah should be forced to leave Iran because only with a departure would Bakhtiar have a chance to survive. The Shah might have also changed his mind after the conversation he had with the British ambassador, Anthony Parsons. When the Shah described for Parsons the different potential candidates, the ambassador was clearly not in favor of Sadiji. Parsons urged that Sadiji would be well advised to consult the religious leaders in Qom, added that unfortunately he is generally regarded as an atheist, and finally ventured that Khomeini was bound to do his utmost to destroy a government led by Sadiji. On December 7, 1978, the White House announced that Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, the President of France, had invited President Jimmy Carter, German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt, and British Prime Minister James Callaghan to personal and informal conversations on political matters and international developments of special interest to their mutual relations. The meetings were to be held on January 5th and 6th, 1979, in the French West Indies island of Guadeloupe, one of the last vestiges of France's lapsed colonial grandeur. Each head of state would be accompanied by only one assistant. For the Shah and many of his supporters, this meeting has taken on mythic proportions. It was, they claim, the watershed moment when the decision to get rid of the Shah was finalized. Zbigniew Brzezinski was the assistant accompanying Carter. For the Shah, this should have been excellent news. He knew that Brzezinski was one of the most stalwart supporters. Just before departing for the meeting, Brzezinski told reporters that the worsening situation in Iran was likely to figure prominently in the four leaders' discussions. He had the Carter will reiterate his support for the embattled Shah of Iran, and that he anticipated the other leaders to agree with Carter's backing for the Shah. 2 days before the summit, Brzezinski suggested to Carter that he send an emissary to Tehran under Guadeloupe as a sign of U.S. interest, and as the reflection of a common Western interest. There are apparently no minutes of the four leaders' meetings at the Hammock Hotel on the southern coast of the Guadeloupe island of Grande Terre. They met under a thatched roof, open-air cabana affair known locally as Ajupa. The Caribbean, perhaps 30 yards away, more than 120 journalists traveled with the president, and somehow they knew that during the first 3-hour meeting, Carter and Callahan did most of the talking. At the end of the summit, the four heads of state offered some remarks about the meeting. In none of the four brief comments was Iran even mentioned. More than once it was suggested that there were no decisions made during the meetings, but simply amicable discussion covering such topics as SALT, Cambodia, China, Russia, and Japan. The only leader who made what appears to be an allusion to Iran was Carter, who declared, "We discussed the potential trouble spots of the world, and we tried to capitalize upon the unique opportunity that one of several of us have to alleviate tension, to let the people of these regions find themselves, with our assistance on occasion, a better quality of life and enhanced human rights. There are fascinating differences between official accounts of the meeting and what the leaders later remembered or wrote in their memoirs. Carter recalls little support for the Shah in the meeting with the leaders, unanimous in saying that the Shah ought to leave as soon as possible. Other leaders' recollections of the meeting, particularly those of the French and German leaders, essentially repeated the same idea. The Shah was bereft of support, and Khomeini was the sole, albeit less than desirable, alternative. In their recollections, however, it was in fact Carter who first suggested the idea of the Shah's departure. The United States was monitoring Soviet reaction to the Guadalupe summit rather carefully. Official Soviet commentary saw it as a reflection of growing differences within the capitalist world, and as yet another attempt by the Big Four to coordinate a response to Japan and its rising might. A day before the conference, on January 5th, the Soviet regime accused the United States of political skullduggery and of attempting to change the course of events in Iran. From the tone of the Soviet reports, the skullduggery they expected was intended to keep the Shah in power, not undermine him. Afterwards, the Soviets claims that from what they knew of the meeting, there had been no discussion of Iran. As noted, while Carter was in Guadalupe, negotiations were going on in Iran for the formation of a government of national reconciliation. After his last meeting with the Shah, Sadeghi declared his readiness to commence work immediately and said that he would wait for the Shah's decision. But the Shah decided he did not want Sadeghi. He chose to appoint Bakhtiar. Carter received information about the new Bakhtiar cabinet while still in Guadalupe. It was clear to everyone that the appointment of General Jam to War Ministry may be the key to gaining army support for the new government. Sadeghi had made a Jam appointment one of his conditions for the accepting the job of Prime Minister. The American report affirmed that Bakhtiar and the Shah had both urged Jam, who had a reputation for outstanding ability and integrity, to return from Europe, where he had been living since 1971. Jam was known to have retained significant contacts within the armed forces, and for having had several confrontations with the Shah, particularly during his tenure as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He had complained that no officer in any capacity had independent authority. Jam had also lamented that all good officers had been purged. His own dismissal had come when, in response to some Iraqi provocation, he had ordered a few units of the Iranian army to the Iraq border. "Who gave you permission to stick your nose in this?" the Shah had demanded, adding menacingly, "In Iran no one is allowed to take this kind of liberty." After this humiliating encounter, Jam was relieved of his duties, forced to retire from the military, and sent to Spain as Iran's ambassador. The return of Jam proved a disaster. In his meeting with the Shah on January the 3rd, He insisted that if he was to be effective as Minister of War, he needed to have all the constitutional powers afforded the ministry in its control of the military. The Shah stubbornly insisted on not only retaining his role of commander-in-chief, but also on controlling the military budget. Disgusted, Jam left Iran. With him went the chance for the Bakhtiar government to maintain some control of the military in the absence of the Shah. It took the military 36 days before it turned against the new Bakhtiar government and tried to make its peace with the mullahs. The U.S. Embassy helped General Moqaddam, the head of Sabak, and General Abbas Garabaghi, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to actively pursue the goal of making peace with the mullahs. In a commanders' meeting that brought together the country's top military brass, one general, in a moment of candor, declared that the military was melting like snow. As the Shah made last-minute plans to leave the country, he could exclaim with Shakespeare's Richard II, "Oh, that I were a mockery king of snow."